There comes a quiet moment, not dramatic, not loud, when something inside you finally says no more. No more shrinking to fit, no more apologizing for your truth, no more abandoning yourself just to be accepted. It doesn't always happen in a burst. Sometimes it unfolds in silence. You say no for the first time and feel like you've committed a crime. You disappoint someone who was used to your silence. You let go of a relationship that once felt like your lifeline. You take a deep breath and choose yourself. Carl Jung described this as the beginning of individuation, the sacred return to the self after a lifetime of living through the expectations of others. It's not rebellion, it's remembrance. You were never meant to live as a mirror for someone else's comfort. You were meant to be a soul, whole and unfiltered, but for so long you made yourself smaller. You said yes when everything in your body screamed no. You gave when you were empty. You tried to be the one who understood, even when no one understood you. You called it compassion, but deep down you knew it was fear. Fear of being alone, fear of not being enough, fear of being too much. But one day, you wake up and realize the cost of betraying yourself is greater than the cost of losing others. And so you begin. You don't become colder, you become clearer. You don't become selfish, you become sovereign. You don't stop loving, you start including yourself in that love. This video is not about becoming someone new. It's about returning to who you were before the world told you who to be. Because the moment you choose yourself, you don't lose your light. You finally begin to shine. At first, it feels unnatural. Saying no, taking up space, speaking your truth without checking if it makes everyone else comfortable. You were trained not to do this. To be agreeable, to be easy to love, to avoid conflict, even at the cost of your own peace. But something inside you has changed. You no longer want to be chosen for who you pretend to be. You want to be seen, fully, wildly, honestly, even if that means some people will look away. Carl Jung wrote that we all create a persona, a mask we wear to survive the expectations of society. It helps us belong, but after a while, it starts to suffocate us, because you can only fake yourself for so long before your soul begins to rebel. And when that rebellion starts, it doesn't look like rage. It looks like clarity. It sounds like a voice rising in your chest that says, I don't need permission to be here anymore. You stop apologizing for your emotions. You stop dimming your excitement. You stop asking others to validate what you already know. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you start honoring. You start respecting your time, your boundaries, your energy, not as something to be earned, but as something that already belongs to you. The more you choose yourself, the more you realize your voice was never too loud. They were just not ready for your truth. Your needs were never excessive. You were simply surrounded by people who benefited from your silence. And now you're done whispering your worth. You're done shrinking into versions of yourself that feel safe to others, because your life doesn't need permission slips anymore. It needs presence. It needs truth. It needs you, exactly as you are, without apology. At first, you think they'll stay. You assume that the people who claim to love you will be happy to see you bloom, that they'll applaud your growth, honor your truth, respect your boundaries. But then, they start to pull away, not because you changed too much, but because you finally stopped pretending. Carl Jung said that when we reclaim the self, we break the unconscious contracts we made with others. Contracts that said, I'll stay small if it keeps you close. I'll say yes so you won't leave. I'll absorb your chaos so you won't have to face it. When you stop honoring those contracts, some people feel betrayed, not because you wronged them, but because they only knew how to love the version of you that was easy, convenient, compliant. And now, you've become true. You no longer laugh at what you don't find funny. You no longer say, I'm fine when you're aching inside. You no longer give endless second chances to people who keep choosing your absence over your presence. And suddenly, they don't know what to do with you. They say you've changed. They say you're distant. They say you've lost your light. But your light was never the problem. It was just too honest for those still living in shadow. And yes, it hurts. Losing the comfort of the familiar. Watching people drift away who once felt like home. But sometimes home was a cage, and now you're choosing freedom. You're learning to love without abandoning yourself, to connect without performing, to exist without asking, is this version of me acceptable to you? Because the real you, the one underneath the mask, doesn't need approval. It just needs space to breathe. So when people leave after you choose yourself, let them. They weren't rejecting you. They were grieving the mask you no longer wear. And what comes next will love you for everything you are. Not just the parts that made them feel comfortable. You used to second-guess everything. Is this okay? Will they understand? Should I wait for a sign from someone else? You looked outward for confirmation, for green lights, for someone to say, yes, it's safe to be who you are. But now something has shifted. You no longer need permission, because your intuition has grown louder than their opinions. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious is not a void, but a living, guiding intelligence, a sacred compass pulling us toward wholeness. And when you begin to align with yourself, that compass takes over. It speaks in subtle waves, in gut feelings, in knowing without proof. At first it feels reckless, to follow what only you can hear, but soon it becomes the only voice that feels honest. You stop explaining your choices. You stop editing your truth. You stop filtering your feelings to make others comfortable. Because you finally learned your soul doesn't need a consensus. It needs coherence. And suddenly, things start to change. You leave situations without waiting to be pushed. You say no without offering a long apology. You follow the nudge instead of the noise, and others might not understand. They'll ask, what are you doing? Why now? Who gave you this idea? And you'll smile, because the answer is quiet. You did. You stopped outsourcing your truth. You stopped treating your body like a liar. You started trusting the sacred data that comes from within. This is the power of alignment. It doesn't always look logical, but it always feels like relief. You're no longer waiting for approval. You're walking in resonance, and no opinion, and no matter how loud, can silence a soul that finally remembers its own voice. There was a time when you called it love, the inconsistency, the coldness followed by crumbs of affection, the way they made you feel like you were too much, then begged you not to leave. You held on thinking it was passion. You forgave thinking it was loyalty. You shrank thinking it was compromise. But now, you feel it differently. Carl Jung taught that as we come into contact with our true self, we stop being available for projections, ours and others. And many of the relationships we once called love were not love at all. They were survival. They were need. They were trauma bonding disguised as devotion. And once you choose yourself, those dynamics become unbearable. What once felt like home now feels like heaviness. What once felt familiar now tastes like betrayal, because real love doesn't require you to disappear. You start noticing who drains you and who restores you, who listens to your silence and who talks over your soul, who respects your boundaries and who only stays close when you're bending them. And you walk away, not in anger, in clarity, not to punish Maud, but to protect your peace. You no longer romanticize chaos. You no longer confuse attachment with depth. You no longer need to be chosen to feel worthy. Because now you know, real love isn't loud. It's steady, it's consistent. It feels like calm, it feels like space. And anything less than that is no longer welcome in your field. You don't become colder when you evolve. You become clearer. And in that clarity, the only love you accept is the kind that doesn't ask you to betray yourself to keep it. You used to over-explain everything, why you said no, why you needed space, why you felt what you felt. You twisted yourself into softness, into logic, into carefully chosen words, just to be understood, just to make sure no one misread your heart. But no matter how many times you tried, they still didn't see you, and eventually you realized they never wanted to. Carl Jung wrote that when the self stabilizes, the ego no longer needs to defend itself. The constant explaining, the desperate clarifying, that was the voice of the wounded self seeking permission to exist. But now, you've outgrown that. You've learned that people who truly see you don't need long explanations. They feel you. They hold space for you without needing a presentation. And those who keep demanding your defense, they were never listening. They were looking for a version of you that served them. So you go quiet, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. Your silence is not passive, it's protective. It's the sacred boundary that says, my truth doesn't need to be negotiated. You stop offering your soul to people who only hear with their ego. You stop bleeding emotion into containers that were never meant to hold you. This isn't withdrawal. It's refinement. You are not here to convince anyone of your value. You are here to embody it. And the ones who are meant to meet you in that space, they won't need a paragraph to understand your sentence. They'll feel it, because truth doesn't always need volume. Sometimes it just needs presence. There was a time when peace depended on being understood, on being validated, on hearing someone say, you're right. You chased clarity through the mouths of others. You tied your worth to being seen, being chosen, being accepted. But now, something has shifted. You still walk through a world that misunderstands you. Still meet people who reduce you to old versions of yourself. Still feel the silence where once there was connection, but somehow you are calm. Carl Jung believed that true individuation is not the removal of conflict, but the integration of it. Peace is not when everyone approves of you. Peace is when you no longer need them to. It's quiet, it's internal, it doesn't need applause. You feel it when you no longer chase people who left, when you no longer overstay in spaces that feel misaligned, when your solitude becomes a sanctuary, not a punishment. And this peace, it's not loud. It doesn't look like joy all the time, but it feels like home. It's the moment you exhale after years of holding your breath. It's the stillness after the storm of becoming. You're no longer trying to be palatable. You're no longer translating your soul into a language others prefer. You speak softly now, not because you're small, but because your truth no longer needs to shout. And yes, the world may still not understand you, but for the first time, you do. You walk differently now, not faster, but freer, and that's what choosing yourself creates. Not a life without difficulty, but a life with peace that doesn't depend on anything but your alignment. There's something sacred that happens when you choose yourself. The world may not shift instantly. People may still leave. The old life may not fall away all at once, but something deeper begins to move. Carl Jung believed that the outer world reflects the inner one, and when you stop betraying yourself, the universe responds, not with applause but with alignment. New paths emerge, synchronicities increase, opportunities arrive that feel like they were always meant for you. Not because you tried harder, but because you stopped trying to be someone else. You become a magnet, not for attention, but for truth. For the people, places, and experiences that match your frequency. You are no longer chasing love. You're walking in self-respect, and love begins to meet you there. This is not the end of your journey. It's the beginning of the real one, the one where you no longer wait for the world to see you, because you see yourself now, fully, clearly, tenderly. And when you choose yourself, again, And again in small ways, in hard moments, in private decisions that no one applauds. The universe takes note, because that's what changes everything. You stop asking, what do they think of me? And start asking, is this true to my soul? That is power, that is peace, that is the self, awakened and unafraid. So if this message touched something inside you, if it named what you've been feeling but didn't know how to say, write in the comments, "Today I choose myself." Let it be your signature, your reminder, your gentle revolution. Because the moment you choose yourself, you don't just find your path, you become it.